Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Tales of Home, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. I hadn't touched that gate in 30 years. The hinge still complained a low iron groan that belonged to this part of Wyoming the way sagebrush and big sky do. I set my palm on the crossbar, felt the cold grit of rust and prairie dust, and pressed. The chain looked serious, but the lock was only for show. The bar lifted, the gate swung, and the wind, always working, threaded through and carried the smell of rain that never quite arrives. Prairie Haven Ranch had been a map I folded shut the day my boy Caleb didn't come back from the water. I swore I'd never unfold it again. Yet there I was, boots on rutted dirt. Only the ruts weren't old. The track had been graded recently. Tire marks still held their sharp edges the way a pie crust holds a thumbprint. A windmill spun slow on the ridge, new steel, not the splintered wheel I remembered. Farther on, I caught the brief music of children laughing, and beyond it a hammer driven in a steady carpenter's rhythm. Abandoned land doesn't laugh or square its corners. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Mark. Oldest sons learned to deliver bad news like weather reports professional braced for the blowback. Mom, did you get there? Just take pictures for the listing. Frontier Minerals wants to move quick. 25 million is their last and best. We sign this week and breathe easier for once. His voice held that careful tone people take with widows and veterans of old battles. I'm here, I told him, watching a line of horses crest a pasture rise like a slow dark river. I'll call you. Nora, Mom, don't linger. It's just dirt. We can't keep carrying it. I ended the call. If a place were only dirt, it wouldn't hold a person the way this place held me still. The half-mile in felt longer, like the land was stretching me to see what might snap. When the farmhouse came into view, the first feeling wasn't grief. It was confusion. Fresh paint in a pale, practical white. A porch rail straight as a rule. A greenhouse glinting behind the barn, its roof a quilt of glass. String lines at the edge of a garden where lettuces stood like soldiers. On the far side, a small swing set threw a child up into that violent, generous sky. People moved everywhere, doing necessary things, with their heads down and their hands sure. The woman who walked toward me wore a ball cap bleached by sun and a canvas work vest with the pockets filled the way a teacher's desk drawers are, twine, a screwdriver, a folded receipt. Late 40s, maybe 50. She shielded her eyes and took me in the way ranch folks look at weather. What do you bring? What will you take? You must be Nora Harper, she said. I'm Teresa Mendez. Folks call me Tess. Hearing my maiden name on a stranger's tongue startled me. I am, I said. And you are? Caretaker. The word fell gentle, no claim in it. Dr. Harper used to say I ran the place. I say I try not to let it run me. Dr. Harper, I repeated. Even after 6 months, Daniel sounded like a neighbor in the next room, not a man underground. How do you know my husband? She tipped her head toward the house and back again as if measuring what I could carry. He came the month after you left, then every month after that. First Saturdays mostly. Wore the same denim jacket. Drove in quiet, left in quiet. Brought thermoses of coffee to the fence crew because he said hands never heal right when they're cold. My throat narrowed. People tell lies with bad details. Truth is always inconveniently specific. Every month, I said, for 30 years. Never missed, Tess said. Even when the road washed and the county didn't bother to fix it yet. We'd run a tow for him if we had to. A shadow moved fast and sure along the porch rail. Then a young man stepped into the light with the careful pride of someone crossing a good bridge. He wore a clean flannel and a leather bracelet with his name stamped into it, Eli. His smile was a bright slice under dark eyes. Hi, Ms. Nora, he said, extending a hand with ceremony. I'm Eli. Alma is my mom. We live by the big cottonwood. Today is Tuesday. Tuesday is yellow flowers for Caleb's Cove. He said my boy's name like a hymn nobody was embarrassed to sing. I took his hand. It was warm and steady. Caleb's Cove, I asked. The lake, he said, solemn now. We give it flowers so it remembers to be kind. Ms. Tess says kindness is a habit like brushing teeth. The habit of kindness. Daniel's words, I thought, are close enough to fool me. Come inside, Tess said. You've been driving and remembering. There's water on the sideboard and pie in the kitchen if Rose has been at it. Pie, I said, because small words keep you upright when big ones make you sway. Blackberry, Eli said, delighted. Rose makes the crust with lard. It scares people, but that's why it's good. Inside, the old entryway had learned new tricks. My hand found the banister like a blind person returning to a room she once knew in the dark, but the parlor was an office now, 3 desks in a row, a whiteboard with a grid of names and chores, a corkboard pinned with permission slips and hand-sketched maps. There was order, not display, everywhere I looked. Tess set a glass in my hand and waited until I drank. Not everything about care is tenderness. Some of it is simply refusing to hurry. Daniel left something for you, she said at last. Said to give it to you when you came on your own feet. She walked to an old dry sink and lifted out a tin box the size of a fat dictionary. It was an army surplus ammo can, the kind my father used to keep nails in. Someone had stenciled Harper in white on the side. A brass key hung from twine tied in a square knot. My hand knew the feel of that key before my mind caught up. Daniel's knots were always neat, always 2 extra turns to keep the world from slipping. He asked me not to open it, Tess said. Said you'd know where to do that part. Where to? Eli supplied the answer with the satisfaction of someone who loves getting the rules right. At the cove, he said. Always by the water for important things. My phone buzzed again. Mark. Mom, the county commissioner's calendar is tight, he said, not bothering with hello. Klein can slot us Thursday if we show good faith and send proof of intent today. Frontier's team is already drafting. I'm not sending anything today, I said, watching a little girl skip past the open doorway with a towel over her shoulder. The towel was sun-bleached edges fraying, but she carried it like a banner. I need some time here. We don't have time, Mark said. The lithium market won't wait on sentiment. I let the word sentiment roll through me and out again. I'll call you, I said, and put the phone away. In the kitchen, a pie the size of a hubcap cooled on a wire rack. I could have cried just looking at it. My mother used to say there are only 2 honest foods, bread and pie. Everything else is someone's experiment. Tess set the tin box on the oak table that still had the burn mark from a Dutch oven. She slid the key across to me, and then with the respect of a nurse drawing a curtain at a hospital bed, she stepped back. I didn't make a speech. I didn't pray. I turned the key. Inside were 3 artifacts wrapped in an old bandana, a cassette tape in a cracked plastic shell with Daniel, Nora scrawled in black marker, a small memory card taped to an index card that read in Daniel's neat block letters, Nen Notes 2019 to 2024, and a letter addressed in his hand for Nora, by the water. I touched the letter first. Stationery, not printer paper, the kind Daniel bought at the downtown stationer where they still cut envelopes with a knife. The ink had bled in one place, a dot the size of a tear. I pressed the envelope to my sternum the way mothers press babies there, as if the chest could teach the thing a rhythm. I can show you the way Eli offered, hovering in the doorway with the same patience I used to see in Caleb when he waited for me to tie a lure. It's not far, just past the cottonwoods. We have a new dock. The steps are safe. There are rules now. There are rules, Tess echoed, not smiling. Made with care, followed with intention. I closed the lid on the tin box, not to hide its contents, but to carry them without spilling. The wind moved through the kitchen screen and left a coolness on my skin like someone had opened a cellar door. Outside, a bell rang, one clear note, and the sound traveled across the yard, the way news used to move in a small town, not urgent, not idle, just true. I took the box. The bandana smelled faintly of machine oil and cedar. In another life, I would have said it smelled like home. Thank you. I told Tess and Eli, and that was all. Some words, like boxes, have to be opened where they belong. Eli walked ahead with the purposeful stride of a guide who knows where the ground dips. Tess kept an easy pace beside me, her shoulder just close enough that if I tipped, I'd find steadiness. We passed the big cottonwoods, their leaves flicking silver in the breeze like fish turning in sun, and the path broke open to water. I had remembered the lake as a maw, dark, unbordered, hungry. Caleb's Cove was not that. A curved dock arced from the shore like a patient arm, its planking new and tight, a rail on both sides, and midway along it, a small observation tower with a bell and a rescue ring threaded on a rope. Solar buoys bobbed across a cordoned rectangle, each the size of a lunch pail, each winking a soft, steady light, even in daylight, like they were practicing for dusk. A laminated sign at the entry steps laid out the rules in block letters. Never swim alone. Adults in sight, instructors in water. Life jackets until level 3. Whistle means out. Tuesday's yellow flowers. Who added the last one, I asked. Eli lifted his chin. Me, he said, pleased, and Miss Tess said I could if I used the stapler right. Beyond the dock, the water wore a surface the color of hammered tin, busy with breeze. Someone had planted native grasses along the curve of shore and braced them with stones, the whole line sewn down, the way you'd sew a hem that used to fray. To the right, under a cedar, a low granite marker sat in a bed of wildflowers. No angel, no carved cherub, just a plaque the size of 2 hands. Caleb Harper, 1992-2002. For every life kept safe, his name is said. Swim roster 52, losses. The numbers were not printed. They were written a permanent marker over clear tape, the kind you peel and replace when the line changes. I could stand in a museum and keep dry eyes, but the sight of tape, ordinary and stubborn, broke me faster than marble ever had. Tess stayed quiet. Eli crouched by the flower bed, carefully arranging a handful of small yellow blooms he'd carried in a mason jar. In my chest, grief moved the way old cattle gates move, slow, protesting, but sure. We'll give you some room, Tess said, nodding toward a bench tucked under the cedar. She set the tin box on the wood, then produced from her vest a small square cassette player. Panasonic scuffed the play button, stubborn. "I figured you'd need this," she said. "Batteries are new." I sat. The bench had been hewn from a log left rough where a hand might like to feel the history of a tree. I traced a knot with my thumb, then opened the box. The bandana made a soft whisper against metal. I took out the cassette, the letter, and the little memory card. I put the card back too modern to suit the day. The letter felt heavy, the way an apple feels heavy when you're hungry. I opened it by the water as instructed. Nora. The letter began, and my name in Daniel's hand felt like warm breath in a winter kitchen. If this is in your hands, then I will have failed at the thing I most wanted, and succeeded at the only thing left. The failure telling you in person. The success building something that might bear the weight of the truth. He did not clear his throat on paper, but I could hear it, the old automatic courtesy before a hard sentence. I told our boy he could go to the dock that morning. He asked, and I said yes, and I told him I'd be along in a quarter hour. The tractor was stalling, and I thought I could beat the clock. You were in the kitchen with flour on your cheek, thinking I had him. I was in the barn with grease on my hands, thinking he was waiting where I told him to. I have no sentence for what sits between those facts, and I will not pass it to you to carry any longer. If there is blame, it sits in the pocket of the jacket I wore that day, and I have worn it every day since. The letter didn't shrink the world to two people. It widened it. I came back here because I couldn't make this place stop speaking. I tried to close it up the way you do a room after a sickbed, but the land wouldn't take the sheet. So I built. I learned the stubborn mathematics of prevention. I counted lives kept safe and wrote them down. When the number changed, I changed the tape. His ink had smudged where his hand must have dragged over wet words. He'd never quite learned to wait. If you've walked to the cove on your own feet, the rest belongs to your ears. Be kind to them. I set the letter in my lap and slid the cassette into the player. The machine whirred in that particular analog way, wheels magnetic strip effort. Daniel's voice arrived with a faint hiss, deeper than I remembered, lined with air. "Hey, Elle," he said, using the name almost no one else used for me. "If you're here, I'm grateful and terrified in the same breath. I'm by the water. It's Tuesday." Eli put flowers down. He let a silence live a moment. Wind and waves slipped into the tape. "I told Caleb he could go," he said plain. No apology set dressing. I told him to wait, and I didn't make sure. If you need the fact to said out loud, I can. I can say it every day. But I'm not calling you to bruise us both. I'm calling to say I built a habit stronger than regret. I brought instructors. I wrote rules anyone can remember with their heart racing. I learned that prevention is a craft, not a wish. Tess and Eli stayed just far enough that they were shapes, not faces. A sound carried across the water, the bell on the watchtower giving a single testing note, and two teenagers in red shirts walked the dock with clipboards counting the buoys, making adjustments. Daniel's voice continued quieter. "I don't believe in atonement as a ledger. I do believe in habits. If you make enough of the right ones, they might add up to a kind of mercy." The tape clicked when he moved the recorder, and I could hear his breath when he looked up, the way we all breathe differently when we take in a big sky. I pressed stop. The world resumed in layers, insect whir, water nipping at posts. Eli humming under his breath, a little girl practicing a whistle with no sound, yet just cheeks and hope. "How many instructors?" I asked Tess. "Depends on the roster," she said, coming back to the bench and crouching so we were eye level. "We never run fewer than 2 in the water, 1 on the dock with a ring and 1 in the kayak inside the ropes. CPR for everyone. Cold water protocol posted by the ladder, dry suits in the boathouse. Nobody swims without signing in, and nobody signs in without a grown-up who knows what they're promising." And the 52, I nodded toward the plaque. "You keep a list. Names and dates," she said. "We also write down the day each kid figures out how to float. That one matters more than ribbons." Eli looked up bright. "I can float." I learned to look at the clouds and count fence posts, and then my body remembers to be a boat. "Who taught you?" I asked. "Mr. C," he said. He was almost in the Olympics before a truck said no. He has a carbon leg that is fast in the water. He says water doesn't care. I watched a broad-shouldered man with a smooth stride and a decal of an old swim club on his shirt step out from the boathouse. He tested the ladder with his foot as if it were an old friend who sometimes had opinions. He spoke to the teenagers with respectful economy, and they answered in kind. "You'll meet Carlos when it's time," Tess said. "For now, we mostly stand and breathe." A truck door slammed up by the house, 2 in quick succession, impatient like punctuation used too often. Mark's voice carried before he did the way certain voices always have. He appeared on the path suit cut for a city dust already finding him. He looked at the dock, the tower, the sign, the marker, and then at the tin box by my side. "What is all this?" he said, as if correct nouns were a luxury. "Safety," I said. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, the gesture the pediatrician taught him to calm a headache when he was 7. Mom, I've been on hold with Frontier for an hour. Commissioner Klein's office called back. They can wedge us in Thursday if we signal intent to proceed. We need to move. We're not sending anything today, I said. I'm listening. Listening to what waves, he realized he'd said it out loud and softened. I'm sorry. It's just we can't keep bleeding money for a memory. Mark Tess said, standing with a posture that didn't ask for permission. You must be Nora's boy. I'm Tess. Dr. Harper asked me to make sure the ranch pays its bills. We're not bleeding, we're balancing. He flicked his eyes over her the way men trained in numbers evaluate a line item. On what income? Vegetable contracts, a small furniture shop, grants donations, she said. And a trust. Whose trust? Harper Trust, a new voice answered. The man who came down the path wore a tweed sport coat you only get away with in the American West if people know the rest of your story. His hair was white, but his eyes were courtroom young. He rolled himself in a chair with the ease of a person who refuses help until he asks. Harold Lee, he said, stopping where the path widened. Former JAG Admiralty law until I grew out of oceans and into grass. Your father found me sleeping in a hayloft and put me to work. I drew what he asked for, and then I drew what he needed. Mark blinked. There's a formal instrument. There's an irrevocable charitable trust recorded, audited, twice solvent, Harold said. The land sits in it with restrictions as stubborn as mule feet. Extraction is addressable only with environmental guarantees that don't exist in a brochure. If the land is in trust, Mark said carefully, trying to locate his footing. Why did Frontier approach us? They approach everyone, Harold said. And they read obituaries. They like grief. I heard what he didn't say and looked at the water because the earth felt too honest. Harold tapped a folder on his lap. Commissioner Klein has placed a hearing on the county docket, he said. Statute requires it when there's a petition to alter land use adjacent to a public right-of-way. We have a slot. 48 hours. It isn't a vote on your family. It's a room. Mark exhaled the air, leaving him with more weariness than fight. I just need numbers, he said, almost to himself. Something I can hold while I talk to a banker who doesn't care about bells and buoys. Then you'll get them, Harold said. But not from a salesman. I put the letter back in its envelope, slid it under the bandana, and closed the tin box. The solar buoys winked steady, a metronome laid on water. Eli stood and brushed dirt from his knees like a small gentleman. It's Tuesday, he reminded no one in particular, so we did the flowers. Yes, I said. My voice felt like it had slept and woken properly for the first time in a long season. We did. By late afternoon, the wind had softened and the light turned the pasture a forgiving color. Tess walked us back toward the house. Eli fell in beside me with the satisfied quiet of someone who has completed a Tuesday correctly. The bell near the barn rang once, then twice, and the yard shifted the way a town shifts when the noon whistle blows. Chores tucked themselves in, doors opened. People aimed themselves toward a meal. The old barn had a new belly. Inside the rafters held strings of warm bulbs, and the air smelled like honest work bread, cooling onions, softening in cast iron sawdust, never fully swept from a corner. Long round tables filled the space. Rose, the woman Eli had promised, stood behind a counter with her white hair in a bun as tight as a fist and a third pie cooling beside her like a promise she fully intended to keep. Gratitudes first, Tess said, as if we were being introduced to a family rule that had been sturdy long before we showed up. People rose by twos and threes. A veteran in a denim shirt thanked Carlos for checking the kayak seals. A young mother thanked Alma for watching her boy during her shift at the greenhouse. A teenager in a track jacket thanked the quiet room for existing when he couldn't himself. When it came near our table, Rose's hand found mine and squeezed like an old friend's greeting. I'm grateful Nora came home hungry, she said. The room knew what to do with that line. Laughter softened. Plates began to move. Stew thick with beans and beef landed in front of us, then bread with a crust that crackled like leaves underfoot. Mark sat stiff in his chair the way men do when the chair belongs to another way of living. He looked at the stew as if it had arrived with a bill he hadn't asked to pay. A woman in a navy blazer slipped in and took the open chair beside me. She set her phone screen down like a person trying to choose where to pay attention. Jenna, she said, not quite a question. I breathed. You made it. Flight to Riverton rental car that thinks it's a tractor, she said, dry as a Wyoming joke. Then she looked around and let the dryness melt off. This is, she didn't finish, which felt correct. Harold rolled to the table, a folder balanced on his knees. Tess set a yellow legal pad and 2 pens down with the same practicality she would have applied to a ladle and a stack of bowls. The man knew our language. The woman knew how to translate it for a room that didn't love paper. Numbers, Mark said, rubbing his thumb over a crease near his second knuckle. If we're keeping something, I need to see what it is. Ledger, not sermon, Harold said. He opened the folder. Trust corpus the land and structures. Endowment seeded by the sale of the North Tract mineral-free to Cedar Basin. Cooperative $3 million net of fees. Investments laddered, plain and boring. Annual yield covers utilities, insurance, basic stipends. earned income from vegetables, furniture shop, hydroponic surplus, and the writing program. Grants restricted to program costs. Donations unrestricted to patch holes when weather decides it knows better than we do, and the people Jenna asked. Her lawyer voice was not the one she used at Thanksgiving. This one made room for answers. 47 residents right now, Tess said. 18 veterans, 9 women, and 11 kids, out of domestic mess, 2 families waiting on immigration paperwork, Eli and Alma, and 3 staff who are paid full-time because kitchens and barns don't run on wishful thinking. Mark dipped his spoon. He ate as if accomplishing something, and liabilities. None past due, Harold said. A line of credit we try not to touch. An a county hearing that wants our attention instead of our fear. Jenna scanned the budget and then the trust instrument Harold slid over. She turned pages with the care of someone who has watched paper ruin and redeem lives. Irrevocable, she said. With environmental covenants and a public right-of-way clause that forces any extraction petition into daylight. Sunlight keeps mold off the pie, Rose said, and went to cut slices like a juror who has already decided every verdict is going to need sugar. On the far side of his barn, a kid's whistle made a perfect note. Eli beamed as if he had produced it himself. Dylan came in a minute later with hay in his hair and the look of someone who has been around animals all day and would take another dozen minutes just to say goodbye to them properly. He saw me let relief run across his face and off again and took the chair on my other side. How many horses, he asked Tess, like the question was the natural cousin of, how are you? 8 saddles, 2 minis, 1 mule with opinions, she said. Whisper is the new mare, skittish but good-hearted. She drops her head for kindness and raises it for thunder. Dylan's mouth tipped, same as people. We were 3 bites into pie when the lights changed. Not inside the bulbs held steady. Outside through the big doors that were open to let September in the ridge, wore a line of orange the color of bad news. A smell hit a second later, electrical and sharp, like a wire burning under a floor. Then, at the edge of hearing the sound that makes all western towns go quiet, wine changing its mind. Tess stood without standing on anyone's nerves. All right, she said as if we were about to move a couch together. We've drilled. She didn't shout. The room shifted anyway. Alma was already collecting children with a count she kept out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rose lifted pies not because anyone needed dessert, but because you protect work when you can. Carlos set down his fork, took a radio from a hook, and headed for the boathouse with a stride that made the floorboards approve of him. Harold touched his phone screen and the speaker crackled to life. Prairie Haven initiating fire plan, requesting volunteer crew stage at the county road. We have water source and pumps. Mom, Mark said, half rising his eyes on that steady line of orange. Go with the kids. I'm fine, I said, which was both true and insufficient. I turned to Eli. Where do you go, champ? He puffed up a little. To the quiet room with the drawings. I bring the yellow flower book. I keep the door list. Good. Show me. I walked him across the barn as Tess threaded through the room, assigning by name, not by category. Jenna document. Photograph the ridge every 5 minutes from the porch. Mark you're at the generator start switch monitor. Dylan horses halter lead east paddock. Carlos pump 1. Jeff pump 2. Alma quiet room, then inhalers. Rose pantry fill coolers. A volunteer crew truck pulled into the yard, dust wearing red light. The siren only sounded once, a courtesy that says, help without fraying the room. Harold rolled to the door to meet them, offered our plan, like a handshake between competent strangers. Eli showed me the quiet room, 2 couches, a low shelf of books, a wall of drawings that included an unashamed number of lakes. He took up a felt tip and wrote in neat block letters on a clipboard, Tuesday. Yellow, safe. Children settled around Alma like planets around a center of gravity. She handed out damp bandanas to breathe through if smoke found a seam. Back outside the boathouse doors were open. A gas-powered pump coughed and then found its rhythm. A hose thick as a man's forearm ran from the cove and split to 2 lines, one toward the west fence, one to the ridge path. The water hit dust and turned it into dark snakes that wriggled and disappeared. Dylan led the horses in pairs, hands steady, voice low. Whisper came third, wide-eyed, head high. Dylan didn't pull. He put his palm against her neck and breathed like a metronome. You've got time, he told her, which was not true in any way that clocks respect and still worked. Whisper dropped her head that elegant inch and the lead went light. Good, Tess said, passing with an armful of hose clamps. Barn doors are wet, fences too. No heroes, only helpers. The wind bullied a bit, then decided it had made its point and settled to something a human plan could answer. Flames licked juniper and then gave up in the face of soaked grass and a dozen people who knew how to take turns. The volunteer crew set a line at the ridge and nodded at Carlos like he belonged in their calendar. He nodded back like he belonged at our table. When the danger dropped from urgent to watchful sound came back in layers. The pump's steady throat. Someone laughing the kind of laugh that shows you what relief looks like with its boots still on. A radio crackle hotspot West Side handled. And faint but insistent from the open windows of somebody's pickup near the road, the local station KFDL on an ad break. A polished voice promised jobs that sounded like rescue. Frontier Minerals would bring opportunity scholarships training the future if the county would only say yes. The music behind the words was the same one they use for churches and coffee. The turnout gear turned reflex and curiosity toward the sound, then back to the ridge as if refusing to let a song give the work a different name. "Turn that down," someone said without heat, and the radio obliged. Eli appeared at my side with the clipboard against his chest and his pen tucked behind his ear like a man heading into a meeting he intends to get right. "We wrote all our names," he reported. "Even Mrs. Alma, even the tiny twins. We waited for 3 pages. The quiet room is good." "You were good," I said. He nodded once, formally accepting praise like the responsible person he is. Inside the barn, the stew had lost its heat but kept its heart. People drifted back in 2s and 3s. The volunteer crew took paper cups of water and declined pie until Rose insisted, and then accepted pie because there are some women you don't argue with in a kitchen. Whisper blew out breath in the paddock, and Dylan leaned his forehead against her cheekbone the way boys have leaned against horses since the first saddle figured out what it wanted to be. Jenna stood on the porch phone full of Ridge photos, a legal pad stacked with notes written in a hand I hadn't seen since she was 12, and rewrote the rules for bedroom chores on index cards because paper calmed her. Mark came out of the generator shed with grease on his wrist and a look that had nothing to do with profit and loss and everything to do with whether a thing works when you need it to. Tess walked back through the barn with a roll of duct tape and a pencil stuck behind one ear. She touched the edge of a table, the frame of a door, the shoulder of a kid, as if confirming the world's corners were still where she had left them. She caught my eye and didn't hold it long, the way people who have weathered storms refuse to count themselves safe until the smell changes. "Let's eat." Rose called not because anyone had forgotten, but because hunger behaves better when someone speaks to it like a neighbor. We sat again, bowls warmed hands that had just held rope clamps radios. The ridge wore only a bruised seam, now dark and uninteresting to a camera. The pump quieted. The hoses lay there like snakes that had decided to nap instead of strike. At the end of the table, Harold closed his folder as if appearances could go back to being enough, and for a minute they were. The bell by the barn door rang one clear, ordinary note. Not alarm, not triumph, just the sound the metal makes when a person's hand says, "We're here." The county building in Riverton was old enough to be honest about it. The stairs had a dip where 100 small-town arguments had worn them, and the drinking fountain hissed like it disliked being modern. We filed in with the morning ranchers and the afternoon defendants, and the clerk at the door handed out agendas like hymnals. Item 4, petition to amend land use restrictions adjacent to a public right-of-way applicant. Frontier Minerals Impact Area, Prairie Haven. The hearing room smelled like pledge and coffee. Folding chairs had been upgraded to wooden ones that creaked the way a person sighs after chores. The seal of the county hung behind 3 commissioners at a dais, the middle one a man with a politician's haircut he hadn't yet learned to keep from apologizing for. Commissioner Wade Klein called us to order, and the room found its shape. Frontier showed up with easels, a projector, and a woman who wore a smile like a well-cut suit. The company representative, Lance Pruitt, introduced himself and let the smile woman handle the slides. A map with the word resource glowing where we live. A chart of jobs. A photo of teenagers in hard hats grinning like they had just been told how to pay for their lives. Direct lithium extraction, the woman said, tapping a slide that showed a cartoon well sending arrows into blue. Minimal surface footprint, high-wage employment, training partnerships with the community college, scholarships for veterans. Bonds, Harold asked from the 3rd row without raising his hand. He had his sport coat on, the one that made his white hair look deliberate. Reclamation, groundwater worker safety. "We post what's required," Lance said smoothly. "We exceed it when it makes sense." Jenna leaned over and wrote "required adequate" on her legal pad, circled it once. Klein turned on his microphone. Its red light gave the smallest pop like a throat clearing. "We'll take comments once the presentation is complete," he said. The slides moved to taxes and a rendering of a tidy plant sitting on scrub that looked nothing like ours. Jobs numbers, adjectives. When the company sat down, the first speaker card went to a man from town who owned an equipment rental. He liked the idea. His machines needed work. He said diversify the way a man says rain. The clerk called the next card, Mark Harper. My son stood and buttoned his blazer reflexively. He has always believed in the effect of a jacket on a room. He gave his name and our address in Denver, and a woman 3 rows back wrote that down as if knowing where someone sleeps at night helps you understand his day. "My father died 6 months ago," Mark said. "My mother is the surviving spouse on what we understood to be family land. We've been carrying its expenses for years. There are grandchildren whose college is not an abstraction, and a small business that weathered a pandemic by borrowing against faith and planning. I support considering this petition. He didn't say jobs or extraction or lithium. He said college and borrowing and planning. The room understood those words. He sat down and looked at his hands as if they might have written something on themselves while he wasn't watching. Jenna Harper. My daughter stood without the blazer's apology. Her navy jacket looked like a habit she wore because paper rooms like this expect a uniform. Commissioner, she said, the Prairie Haven property sits inside an irrevocable charitable trust with environmental covenants drafted to require public scrutiny for any industrial use adjacent to a right-of-way. You're seeing those covenants do their job. She set a slim stack of exhibits on the clerk's table, each tab in a color that told a story only Jenna could read without a legend. I'm entering letters from a hydrogeologist and a pediatrician, both familiar with this basin. The first notes that direct extraction still requires significant fluid handling, and that this county's alluvial aquifer is a single coat we all wear. The second explains what happens to small lungs when dust finds its way where water once settled it. She didn't raise her voice. She laid out the vocabulary brine drawdown bond monitoring. The clerk stamped the exhibits and the room exhaled. Klein nodded as if he recognized a language from school he'd always meant to take more seriously. Harold rolled forward with a different sort of paper, the kind that carries weight because a person you trust signs his name in ink you know he paid extra for. Harold Lee for the trust, he said. Former JAG. We believe in numbers and in the law that asks numbers to behave. The trust is solvent. The programs it supports serve veterans, abused women and children, and families between homes. The lake on the property is used for a county-approved water safety program that has taught 52 children to float who would have otherwise learned fear. The petition before you is not a referendum on grief, landowners, or jobs. It's a question of whether one promise can live without breaking another. He looked at the commissioners, not at Frontier. If there is to be extraction in this basin, show us a bond that makes the county whole when best-case scenarios do not arrive. Show us monitoring by a third party who doesn't eat from anyone's hand. Show us a plan for dust and traffic that assumes fires come when you are in church and kids fall off their bikes when drivers check their phones. The clerk called Tess. She didn't bring paper. She brought a list in her head, and the kind of voice that makes lists sound like what they are, ways to keep children fed and chores done whether companies come or go. Prairie Haven employs 3 full-time and a web of part-time folks who'd like not to find their wells coughing air next August, she said. We buy from the feed store and hardware from the diner that sells pie like Faith. We move money the way a body moves blood, honest and constant. If you add a plant, we'll learn to share the road. That's what neighbors do. But if you sign a paper that makes the water guess what it's allowed to be, the word you'll hear on bad nights is contamination, and there's no fundraiser that turns that into pie. A man who introduced himself as a retired hydrologist explained why one test well does not equal a plan. A teacher spoke about field trips and any day a kid comes home smelling like lake instead of vape. A nurse described asthma with a steadiness that made the room remember breath. A logger said he liked jobs, and he liked keeping what made the county the county. A rancher talked about drawdown and a map of springs he kept in his head like other men keep hymns. The clerk called another card, Eli Santos. He came forward in his best flannel hands, smooth on the edges of paper that did not have words on it. He stood at the microphone and the red light came on, and the room looked larger than he did, and Eli took a breath you could hear from the third row. I learned to float, he said. My teacher is Mr. C. I look at the clouds and I count fence posts and my body becomes a boat. Tuesdays are yellow flowers at the cove. I write the names. When you float, you can rest without going under. That is all. He didn't look at the commissioners. He looked at the clock, then at the people who clap for the right reasons without making a noise. He returned to his seat like men do after they have said what they were sent to say. Frontier's representative asked to respond. Lance stood with his smile and said Eli was brave, and then said this wasn't about lakes and flowers. It was about a county that needed revenue to keep ambulances from running on prayers. He explained that their technology was new and clean, and that anyone who said otherwise was reading old studies or the wrong ones. He reminded the room of scholarships. The smile woman put up a slide of a graduation cap. The tassel swung in an invisible wind. Klein leaned toward his microphone. Thank you, he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had once been a PE teacher asked to cover civics. The board will ask questions. His colleagues asked about truck routes, emergency response plans, reclamation bonds, surface disturbance, dust suppression, and whether direct meant what it sounded like to people who had watched words get dressed up at meetings before. Lance answered with numbers that stayed whole, a commendable feat for a man talking to 300 ears. Jenna rose again. One question, she said, legal pad in hand. Why is the proposed monitoring vendor paid by the applicant? Industry standard, Lance said. And the bond herald asked, "Where's the number with enough zeros that it makes a banker blink and a county sleep?" "We're in discussions," Lance said. "It depends on the scope approved." Klein conferred with his colleagues the way men in small towns confer heads together, a hand over a mouth, a pencil that draws nothing in particular while it thinks. He looked out at the room and saw a map of what he'd been elected to hold together: a logger, a nurse, a teacher, a rancher, a hydrologist, a boy who floats a widow with a tin box in her bag, a company with a slide for every worry and a number for every past-due dream. "The board will not vote today," he said. "We are asking the applicant to produce a third-party hydro report and a bond proposal sufficient to make the county whole. We are asking counsel for the trust to submit the program documentation mentioned for the record. We set 30 days to complete these filings. We'll reconvene then." The gavel didn't bang. It thudded a softer thing. Papers found their stacks. Chairs remembered how to complain while being pushed in. Outside on the courthouse steps, the midday wind made everyone lean, then laugh, because nothing in Wyoming lets you keep dignity long when weather decides to make a human small. Carlos shook hands with a volunteer who'd stood next to him on the ridge the night before. A logger tipped 2 fingers from his cap at Tess. Rose had packed sandwiches as if hearings burn more calories than fence mending. Eli sat on the low wall with his clipboard and wrote Tuesday in block letters, then underlined it as if the day needed reminding who it was. Mark checked his phone and stared at a subject line that made his jaw think about being stubborn. Jenna tucked her exhibits back into her satchel, slid a pen behind her ear, and stood where she could see the flag whip and the cottonwoods across the street do the same thing with more grace. Harold took a call and said, "Yes, Commissioner, we'll deliver," then hung up and closed his eyes a moment, the way a man does when he's asking memory to be specific about a case from a past life. I put my hand on the stone railing. It was warm where the sun had found it and cool where the shadow kept its counsel. The bell in the county clock winked 12 and did its job without expecting applause. Across the street, a kid pushed off on a skateboard and didn't fall. By the time we turned off the highway and took the gravel in, the heat had gone out of the day. Dust lifted and settled the way a tired dog breathes. The bell by the barn gave a single note, and the yard looked back at us unstartled. Tess met us on the porch with 2 mugs and the look of someone who has a list and room on it for one more thing done right. "Kitchen's open," she said. "So is the office." I carried the tin box upstairs to Daniel's small room above the study. The window faced the cove. From that height, the solar buoys made a dotted line like stitches a careful hand had laid down. I set the bandana on the desk, untied it, and took the little memory card between my fingers. Harold had left a cheap recorder on the blotter with a slot for modern things. I pressed the card in until it clicked. Daniel's voice arrived without the cassette's hiss. It sounded closer, like he had turned his chair toward the window between sentences. 6 months, he said quietly. "That's what the cardiologist gave me. I didn't tell you. I told the ridge and the bell and the water, and they keep a confidence better than any man. If you're listening, Elle, I'm asking one thing that isn't a command and isn't an apology. If you can let your heart lead the ledger. It knows more math than men like me admit." I shut it off because I had heard what I needed. Down in the yard, Jenna stood with Harold at the picnic table flipping through copies while the ink dried. Mark leaned against the generator shed with his tie loosened and his eyes on the cove the way a person watches a word he mispronounced for years finally because he said right by somebody else. We gathered in the office because rooms with old wood make decisions simpler. Harold slid an envelope across the desk. The paper had Daniel's square handwriting across the top, appointment, community historian, and heartkeeper. He drew this up before Harold said, "It's an appointment, not a burden. Stipends modest. Duties are plain record, remember, remind." I held the pen. My hand didn't shake. "I'll take it," I said. The words fit. Dylan came in with hay on his sleeve and Whisper's breath still on his shirt. "I'm staying," he said, not as an announcement, more like a temperature. "If you want me in the writing program, I'll start at sunup." Tess nodded once. We do well with people who show up at sunup. Jenna set her legal pad on the desk and pushed her hair behind one ear. "I filed a notice for pro bono appearance in county matters," she said. "My firm has sabbaticals they brag about. I requested mine." She didn't smile exactly. "I'm not good at most ranch chores. I am good at paper that makes bad ideas work harder." Mark looked at the floor, then at me. "I can't move here," he said. "Tyler's senior year. The business, it isn't portable." He swallowed. "I told Frontier we're not signaling intent today. I also called the bank and set a transfer. First one goes now. It'll cover instructors' life jackets. Whatever Tess tells me is not glamorous and always necessary." "Nobody buys buoys for a plaque," Tess said. "They buy buoys because kids float." "Then buy buoys in my name," Mark said, almost relieved to be told what to do. Eli knocked on the doorframe the way polite people do, no matter how well they're loved. "It's almost dark," he reported. "I have the clipboard. We can check the lights if you want." We walked down to the cove together, me, my children, Harold rolling Tess with a flashlight. She didn't turn on yet, because dusk belonged to the day for a few more minutes. The dock boards held us. The tower bell stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a hand on your back, not a finger on your mouth. Eli read the list. Solar 1, 2, 3. The buoys winked in sequence, obedient as a choir. When he reached the last, he tapped the plaque lightly, a habit he'd invented or inherited. I set my palm on the granite beside his and felt the stone give back only what stone can: steadiness, not answers. Jenna exhaled a long lawyer breath that leaves a room and gives it back better. Dylan crouched to run his fingers in the water and came up wet, the way boys always have when they need reminding the world still touches them. Mark stood with his hands in his pockets and the night making his shoulders look like they might learn another way to carry weight. Tuesday, Eli said, satisfied. Yellow. Safe. Safe, I said, and the word didn't feel like robbery anymore. On the way back, the kitchen light threw a warm square on the yard. Rose had left a plate wrapped in wax paper and a note in pencil pie keeps. Eat before it forgets what it's for. R. Tess reached past me and rang the bell just once, not to summon, just to mark. The sound went out and came back thinner, the way sound does when it's done its job and can go rest. Later in Daniel's room, I put the bandana back in the box and slid the box into the shelf, where his paperbacks leaned on one another like men at the counter after church. I opened the window and let the night in. Out on the water, the line of lights kept time, no one argued with. I said my boy's name to the dark, not as an apology, not as an oath, just as a name that belonged here, and listened as the cove answered with the smallest kind of music a place can make when it agrees. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.